Good afternoon, Pierre.
Well, good morning, Olga. How are you?
Good. What about you? How is your morning?
I'm fine, thank you.
Good. So we're waiting for another participants to join.
Mm.
Sorry about this little delay.
Oh, it's all right. Just a
We had
few
some
minutes.
technical issues. Okay. Dear participants, please mute your microphone so the presentation and the webinar can go smoothly. Okay, I will help you once you join in. If you do not have any intention to ask question or say something, please mute yourself. Well, I think we can start slowly and the other participants can join us. Well, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar today. Thank you for finding time. First of all, I know that it's the start of a new business season. Everyone is busy, but the topic is very important and it will directly influence our business activity. And first of all, let me introduce our dear speaker today. Very honorable person. It's P'єр Dешамp. It's a senior advisor at FTI Consulting, and he knows everything and even a little bit more about carbon pricing, about CBAM, about ETS, carbon markets, and he's pleased to share his expertise today. And as a little reminder, I would like to mention that this webinar is one of the series of events organized with the support of the International Renaissance Foundation and the European Union within the framework of the joint initiative European Renaissance of Ukraine. And one more organizational question is about asking questions. So if you have any suggestion, comment, you're welcome to write them down in the chat, or you can wait until the main presentation is over and you can raise your hand afterwards and ask your questions. And thank you very much for joining, and I'm more than happy to give the floor to Pierre. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Olga. Good morning, everyone. So I'm very pleased to be with you this morning to discuss carbon markets. I hope you hear me. So a short introduction of myself before we go into the matter itself. So I'm P'єр. I'm a Belgian national, educated in Belgium and in the UK. And I have had most of my career working in Brussels for the EU Commission in several DGs, but always dealing with energy, climate, environment, carbon markets. I've done that for more than 20 years. And it included 7 years when I was directly advising the president of the Commission on energy, carbon markets, the environment. I left the Commission 5 years ago, and like Olga said, I'm now a senior advisor with FTI Consulting in Brussels, and I also lecture on carbon markets again at several universities throughout Europe, at Sciences Po in Paris, at Vistula University in Warsaw, and a few other ones. So but that's enough on me. On carbon markets, let me try to share my screen. And you let me know if it works and if you can see my screen.
Yes, it works. Thank you.
Okay, good. So carbon markets, ETS, CBAM, and all the rest. And we will define all of this and try to see what these things are and how they evolve and how they impact the business. So what I would like to go through is, in the first place, the EU ETS, the emission trading scheme. We will see what it is and how it works and the sort of evolution that we can expect of it. We will then do the same with the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Measure. Also try to see what it is, how it works, and what are the expected evolution. We will then go to the ETS and CBAM again, but we will look at them from the point of view of the specificities for Ukrainian businesses. So what does it mean really for you in practice in the next years and months? And then at the end, we will take a look at other types of carbon markets like offsetting and a few other types of carbon markets different from the EU ETS and the CBAM. And we will, even if we have time, we can spend a minute or two discussing the future evolution of the EU Green Deal, because all of those things are building blocks of what we call the EU Green Deal. So the EU ETS, what is it? The emission trading scheme or emission trading system. It's a market mechanism. So by a market mechanism, I mean a mechanism whereby you can buy and sell. You can buy and sell what? Well, you can buy and sell the right to emit a ton of CO2 as an industry. It's a mechanism which started in 2005, so it's not really new. We are now in the fourth phase because the mechanism is reviewed on a regular basis. And so what you can buy and sell is the right to emit a ton of CO2 if you are a large industry. These rights, they are called allowances or allocations, and they exist in a number every year, which goes down year after year. And now that we are after 2020 in the EU Green Deal, there is a number of allowances put on the market every year, which goes down 4% every year from base quantity, which is 2013. That's the detail of legislation. But anyway, there is a maximum number of allowances available, which people call the cap. And that maximum number of allowances goes down every year. So they become rarer and rarer every year. So you could expect that they also become more expensive every year. But we will see that later on. CO2 is included, but not only. Other greenhouse gas like methane, for instance, are also included. Now, who is involved into this? It's not you and me when we heat our places and drive our cars. It's the very large installations. By large installations, the legislation really means more than 20 megawatt thermal. So if there is an installation in your company which is more than 20 megawatt thermal, if you are in the EU, and one day Ukraine will probably be part of the EU, if you're in the EU, you need to buy the same number of allowances as your emissions. If you emit 1 million tons, you need to buy 1 million allowances, and this is going to cost you money. Because every ton that you emit in a year, you need to give back to the authorities the same number of allowances the following year. So that is, of course, from the state point of view, it's a source of revenue. And the revenue, the member states, and again, one day we can expect that Ukraine will be an EU member state. The member state, they have to spend that money not on general stuff like pay the unemployed or build schools. They need to pay, now in the EU Green Deal, 100% of the money that they raise, they must spend it into climate-related measures. And then for the EU industry, that poses a problem because it means that this is an additional cost that an industry, say, in Brazil, for instance, does not have. So it poses a competitiveness problem. And the way that this competitiveness problem has been addressed up to now is that some of those allowances, instead of being sold in auctions by the authorities, they are given out for free. They are given out for free to the industries which are at risk of carbon leakage, the thing is called. The carbon leakage is when there is a risk that the industry is going to go away because there is an additional cost on its emissions. And what does it mean, or how is defined the fact that an industry is at risk of carbon leakage? That is a bit complex, it's a graph, but what it really means is that there is a list of sectors with the ETS which are at risk of carbon leakage, and so they get a fraction of their allowances for free. And they are at risk of carbon leakage if either they have a high trade intensity, so they trade a lot with outside of the EU, so they are in competition with the rest of the world, or the cost increase is substantial, more than 5 or 30%. Cost increase, which is coming from the fact that they have to buy the right to emit. So if they trade a lot, or if the cost increases a lot, then they get a fraction of the allowances for free. That is how carbon leakage is treated up to now in the ETS. And I say up to now because, as we will see in a few minutes, this is changing. And the carbon border adjustment measure, which we will discuss in a few minutes, is a new method to take care of the risk of carbon leakage. But let's not do this now. Let's stay 1 or 2 more minutes with the ETS. And just to show you that those sectors which are at risk of carbon leakage, there is in legislation a long list. And this is just an extract to show you what it looks like. There is a very long list of sectors which are at risk of carbon leakage. And of course, we don't want it to happen. Because if those sectors would go away, it would mean that Europe is deindustrializing itself, which is not something that we want. Now, the ETS, as I said, a market mechanism for the right to emit a ton of CO2, that which we now see is a graph of the price over time in the EU ETS. It started very low, but since 2018, when the Green Deal was announced, the price raised, and it's now around about 70 euros a ton. So clearly, if you are a large industry, if you say emit 1 million ton of CO2, which is not uncommon if you are a big steel industry or a power generation based on coal or whatever, 1 million tons of CO2 a year costs you in the ETS 70 million euros. So we are really talking substantial money. And as it says, that price in the ETS, it was relatively stable through the energy crisis, which came with the war in Ukraine, through COVID. So it's been quite stable between, say, 60 and 100 euros a ton. Why is there a price like this? Well, because the number of allowances is limited. It's the cap that I described a few minutes ago. And on that graph, the cap is the black curve. The black curve is the number of allowances which are available for the industry. The red curve is the new cap. It goes down faster. And the new cap has been announced with the EU Green Deal. So this is the situation in which we are now. The red curve. And the emissions is the blue ones. The blue ones is the emissions which the data is available until last year. And my graph is made until the year before last. But what we see is that the industry in blue is not emitting as much as the cap. So there are enough allowances, but still, even when there are enough allowances, they have a substantial price because everybody knows that the red trajectory is going to come into force. So the price is an expectation price, as economists would say, because it reflects the fact that in future years, there are not going to be enough allowances. And in fact, if I look at the red curve, it goes down to zero. Yeah, I call it a curve, but it's a straight line. The red straight line, which is the number of allowances available in the system, goes down to zero in 2039. Now, 2039 is only 15 years from now. So it means that 15 years from now, the EU industry has no allowance, no new allowances anymore. There may be a few ones left from the previous years, but new allowances, zero in 2039. So this is extremely ambitious. And what I think personally is that the system between now and then is going to have to be revised even more, because I don't think that the EU industry can work with zero allowances in 2039. So the Commission is already discussing that there would be new allowances generated by storing CO2 in nature, in geology, and things like that. But this is another topic, but I'm expecting future evolutions of that system to allow it to work, because nothing left in 2039 is not realistic, I think. Now, this was the ETS. If you allow me to go into our second topic of the day, which is the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Measure. it is very strongly linked to the ETS. And what is it? What is it? Well, it is a new measure to try to take care of the problem of carbon leakage. So up to now, the situation is that if an EU industry is at risk of carbon leakage, it gets the allowances for free. If it's an industry outside of the EU, take Brazil as an example, nothing against them, it's just an example. You look at an industry in Brazil, of course, they don't pay. So now we are in a situation that no one is paying because the Brazilian industry does not pay, they're outside, like a Ukrainian industry, by the way. And the EU industry does not pay because they are at risk of carbon leakage. They are in the list, so they get the allowances for free. So we have a level playing field, which is at zero altitude. The idea of the carbon border adjustment measure, from now on I call it the CBAM. The idea of the CBAM is to maintain a level playing field, but raise the altitude. And the method would be that when an import comes into the EU, for instance, from Ukraine, when an import crosses the border to enter the EU, it pays a CBAM, and the CBAM is the same level as the EU ETS. So the future situation will be again a level playing field, but a level playing field at a higher altitude, and everyone will pay, everybody will pay. The EU industry will pay the ETS, and the Ukrainian industry will pay the CBAM. So that's the idea. But this is a long transition, as we will see. It is going to take a long time between now and when the CBAM will be fully in place. We will see that in a few minutes. So how does it work, the CBAM? This is a commission graph, so sometimes it's not very clear, but let me try and explain. When an import, say a ton of steel, for instance, crosses the border from Ukraine to the EU, the importer has to pay, I don't like to call it a tax, maybe we should call it a levy, has to pay something which reflects the carbon emissions when the product was manufactured in Ukraine, in our example. So that payment on imports makes an equality between the products made in the EU and the products made outside in Ukraine or in Brazil. What products is the next question, because it's not every product. It's a new system, so the Commission has decided to only look at 6 sectors or categories of products, and not all of them, as we will see. But the 6 sectors are cement, iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizers, electricity, and this is relevant for Ukraine, not for Brazil, but there are connections between Ukraine and the EU on electricity, and hydrogen. And in each of the 6 categories, it's not everything. For instance, in iron and steel, it's the raw products mostly. And in each of the 6 categories, it's the raw product. So if you import, say, a washing machine or a car, which is made of steel and aluminium, that does not have to pay because it is a finished product. Even if you import the front bumper of the car, it's a semi-finished product, it does not pay. It's only the big raw material which is in the list to pay the CBAM, and the list of what really pays is again defined in the legislation, and again this is only an extract. There is a list which goes over 2 or 3 pages, so it's not that much, because it's only a few raw products in each of the 6 categories. And the products are identified by their import CN codes. So it's not a new invention. Importers know very well what the CN codes are about. That's the way that every product which crosses a border in the world is identified. And it's by the CN codes that the things which have to pay the CBAM or not are defined. But in our mind, it is simpler than that. It is iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizers, power, cement, and only the raw products. The other thing, which I have said already, is that it does not, we are not going to transition from nothing to CBAM in 1 minute, not even in a year. It is going to take a long time. In 2024, so now, and in 2025, so the first 2 years of the system, the importers only have to declare their imports, so they don't have to pay. It's only from 2026 that payments will kick in. And from 2026, it will not be full payment. There will be a ramp up of payment from a very small amount of money in 2026 to the full CBAM 8 years after, in 2034. So it's only in 2034, so only 10 years from now, that the CBAM will be fully in place with full payment. Why is it so slow? Well, because it's a transition from one system where no one was paying to a new system where everyone pays. To have to pay is never very pleasant. We don't like to pay, right? So industries are in the same situation. Sectors are in the same situation. So it is unpleasant for the EU industries because they see the free allowances in the ETS going away. It is unpleasant for the industries in the rest of the world because they will have to pay the CBAM when their product cross the border into the EU. So it's unpleasant for everyone. So the Commission has decided to do things, say, very slowly, progressively. Also, to have a better chance to see how things work in practice. Because there are, in a new system like that, there are always the initial problems which need to be corrected. This is a nice graph of the red curve is the CBAM kicking in between 2026, 2.5% of the value of the ETS, up until 100% in 2034. And the blue curve, which is exactly symmetrical, is the free allowances going away for the EU industries. So there is that transition of 8 years from 26 to 34 when the CBAM is kicking in and when the free allowances disappear. So it's very progressive. So to the question, when do you need to pay? Well, you need to pay from 2026, progressively more and more until 2034. And that's only for the raw products in the 6 categories. Again, electricity, fertilizers, hydrogen, aluminum, cement, and iron and steel. But the Commission is already saying that the system will be, like every system, reviewed. There is a big review which is planned in 2026. And in the big review, so 2026 is when it kicks in from the payment point of view. And in the same year, they will review the system. And in that review 2026, they are already planning to include more sectors. For instance, pulp and paper will probably be included after 2026 or after 2028, because they will give it more time, because it will be a new sector. But clearly, and pulp and paper is only an example. There are many other sectors, like the chemical sector, for instance. That's one way that the Commission is already thinking to extend the CBAM progressively to all of the economy by including more sectors. And another way that they are thinking to enlarge the CBAM to all of the economy is to include not only the raw products as now, but also semi-finished and maybe finished products in the long term. So, of course, no one has a crystal ball, but it could very well be that, say, in 2040 or 20 years from now, all of the economy, all of the imports, including cars and washing machines and what have you, is included in the CBAM. We will see. It's too early to say. Now, all of that system which I have been describing up to now, and I realize it's a lot of information, but believe me, it's complex, which is why FTI, for whom I work, we are ready to advise on those issues, obviously. An example of complexity, which I wrote down at the bottom of this overhead, is that sometimes we talk of companies. Sometimes we talk of sectors. Sometimes we talk of installations. And sometimes of products. And those four things are into the legislation of the ETS and the CBAM. Obviously, companies are in, because if you are a company, it's the company who pays. It's not a product or a sector. It comes into your financial results at the end of the year. The company pays. But the company is active in a sector. And it's the sectors who are getting the free allowances in the ETS. A company is made of several installations. And it's the installations one by one which are targeted by the ETS. And the company, they hopefully manufacture products. And the CBAM at the border is targeting products. So it's four different notions. It's four different beasts. And all of that is together in the legislation. So it's not easy at all. But what to remember from the CBAM up to now, in the 6 sectors, the raw products, they pay from 2026, progressively more and more, when they cross the border to enter into the EU. And in fact, who is paying? Well, if you are, say, a steel manufacturer in Ukraine, you don't pay. It's the importer who pays. But it's all the same as if you had to pay, because if the importer of your product has to pay, it makes your product more expensive. Sometimes, if you are a steel manufacturer in Ukraine, you will be taking care of the import yourself. So in that case, you pay the CBAM. But if it's somebody else, it's the somebody else who pays, but this is making your product more expensive when it comes into the EU. The notion of economic operator registration identification, that's the way in the legislation that the importers are defined. And as you can read, but this is going a bit too much in the details, you can be in the situation that you are importing into the EU in several member states. This can be made by the same legal entity or by different legal entities, so that it's even more complexity. But what we have to remember is always the same thing. When there is a raw product of the 6 categories crossing the border, it comes more expensive into the EU because of the CBAM. And if you allow me, and then after that, things will become easier. But if you allow me one more slide with difficulties, the difficulty is that I want to talk about a bit is the embedded emissions, the carbon. What are we talking about? Because, okay, if there is a ton of steel crossing the border, but what quantity of carbon are we talking about? The quantity of carbon that we are talking about, or CO2 that we are talking about, is the amount of emissions that took place when the product was manufactured. If you import a ton of steel, well, there's always a little amount of carbon in the steel, but this is not the one that the CBAM is interested in. The CBAM looks at the CO2 emissions when the ton of steel was manufactured. And there can be big differences. You can produce a ton of steel from iron ore with coal, and then there will be very big emissions when the ton of steel is produced. You could manufacture the ton of steel from recycled steel in an electric furnace, and the electric furnace would use electricity coming from windmills or solar panels. And in that case, no emissions. So for a ton of steel, as an example, you can have very high emissions if it was originally manufactured with coal, or very low emissions if it was originally manufactured in an electric arc furnace running on renewables. So just to look at the border, at the ton of steel which is crossing is not enough. But it makes matter even more complex, because up to now, in 2024, importers, they can use default values. And that's easy. The default values are published by the Commission. But those who are manufacturing, let's call it green steel, made in electric arc furnaces with renewable energy, they don't have any advantage in that system because everyone is using the same default values. So the use of default values will come to an end. From 2025, there is an EU method, which still is in definition, to assess the emissions when the product is manufactured. And so it will be site by site. For steel, it will be blast furnace by blast furnace, because every blast furnace in every industry is using different coal to manufacture the steel. And those emissions will need to be certified by auditors in Ukraine or in Brazil to allow the reporting at the time of paying the CBAM. So this is going to be, I regret to say, but this is going to be work also for auditors like McKinsey and companies like that, who will have to give you a certificate of your CO2 emissions to go together with the steel to allow it to cross the border into the EU. Because what is paid is the emissions at the time of original manufacture. It's a very strange game from a lawyer's point of view. From if you study law, if you look at jurisdictions, I am not a lawyer, right? By background, I am an engineer. But if you look at this from the eyes of a lawyer, it's what people call the Brussels effect, because the Commission in Brussels is taking new laws which has an effect on the rest of the world. So not only on the EU, but on the whole world. And it imposes obligations on the steel manufacturer in Ukraine, in Japan, in Brazil, all coming from Brussels. So the system obviously does not have friends everywhere, because when you have to pay, you don't like it. When you have new obligations, you don't like it. It's human. We all react like this. But this is the essence of the CBAM. As I said, it's a system which is going to evolve in the future because it's new, so it has its initial problems. So the Commission is working, as it shows on this overhead with all the dates, on a number of evolution of the system of several kinds, of better defining the reporting obligations, of better defining how to calculate the embedded emissions, on enlarging the system to more sectors, as I said already, on enlarging the system to finished products, as I said already. So this is in constant evolution over the next years. And again, because this is in the making, because it's complex, because if you want to follow this, it requires contact with the Commission. This is typically the sort of issue on which FTI Consulting is ready to help in the details for any practical case, of course. Now, this was the ETS and the CBAM. And but I see things appearing in the chat which I cannot read. Maybe I should have a look at what's in there. Let me go, before we go into the consequences for Ukrainian businesses, let me read out. And I see, do we have any perspective to have the agriculture sector in the CBAM in the CBAM in the nearest future? I would say in the very long term, yes. But this is going to be, if it happens, only in the very long term. And by the very long term, I mean not in the next years. The first enlargement are likely to be industrial sectors, like petrochemical industries, like pulp and paper, like other fuels than hydrogen, but not agriculture in the first place. So it may come, but a very long time from now. This is discussing emissions again. What is the connection between the guarantee of origin mechanism and the ETS and the CBAM? Well, let me simplify this. The connection between the ETS and the CBAM is simply that in order to avoid discrimination, the price of the CBAM is the price of the ETS. So if you are a Ukrainian business and you are sending your products into the EU, what you pay is the ETS. But as we have seen, the ETS is a market. So it is unpredictable. It changes every minute. Now, of course, to pay the CBAM every minute is not feasible. So the way that things are made is that the price of the CBAM will be the weekly average of the ETS. So the ETS price is going to be calculated or averaged over every week, and every week the CBAM will change a bit to be the average of the ETS in that week. I don't really see what you meant by origin mechanism in this context. But the main link between the two systems, same price on a weekly basis. Let's see that there's a new message, which is thanks a lot for the answer. So that does not require any more comment from me. Good. Then we can then maybe move on into the consequences for Ukrainian businesses. I'd like to show you, and I think I have been careful enough to take a map of Ukraine, which is all of Ukraine. Because if you go on the internet, you can find many things. So sad. But if you allow me to look at a study which was made before the war, And the study made before the war had Ukraine on it. And you can see the columns. And Ukraine was going to be affected essentially in the iron and steel business, and then a bit in fertilizers. So then that's simply because of the structure of your industries. Most of the effect would be felt in iron and steel, and then a bit in fertilizers. And by the way, in all the other countries, the one which was heavily touched by the CBAM on its imports into the EU was Russia. But we now know that the trade connections between Russia and the EU have changed precisely because of the war and all the sanctions. And so this is a graph which is pre-war. But then in that graph, Ukraine was almost equally with Turkey, the second trade partner touched by the CBAM mechanism. So it is important and relevant. Another study, which is more recent, was made by the World Bank to look at the impact on trade of the CBAM of all the trade partners around the world. And you can see again that there are one or two in red, but in orange, like in the second category, is Ukraine. So definitely speaking, the trade relations between Ukraine and the EU, and also the nature of the products which go from Ukraine to the EU, and we are mainly discussing steel and fertilizers, they result in the fact that there is a large impact on Ukraine. And what are we really talking about money-wise? To take a little example again, and a small calculation, if you take a ton of steel, and if you produce the ton of steel with classical methods, a blast furnace based on coal and coke, and assume that the ETS is at 70 euros a ton, like now, then what it means is that your average ton of steel, when it crosses the border with the CBAM, becomes 20% more expensive. So it's not nothing. It does not double, but it's not 1% more. It's 20%. So it makes your products all more expensive when they come into the EU. So, and this is quite substantial. And if you look at, this is for the average steel, if you look at very simple steel coming from places like India or China, it can be plus 50% because they have higher emissions at the place of manufacture. So it is quite substantial. Then in that context, there is a big question with which Ukraine as not as an industry, maybe as industrial sectors. And again, FTI in Brussels is ready to represent industrial sectors towards the Commission and other stakeholders. But certainly as a country, there are several possible attitudes. One would be to do nothing. It's always a possibility. This is not philosophy, it's a fact of life. Well, if you do nothing, the CBAM will progressively be applied to the exports to the EU. Simple and easy. The second solution would be to, and it's a country decision by the Ukrainian government in principle, would be to put in place carbon pricing on large industries. It wouldn't make any difference for you, because you would pay in Ukraine, it would be deductible from the CBAM. So you would pay the same total amount, but it would be better for Ukraine because the money would flow into the Ukrainian government rather than go to Brussels, as it says. And many countries like India, like Japan, like Korea, like South Africa, are thinking to introduce carbon prices on their territories, because explicit carbon prices can be deduced from the CBAM. And all those countries logically prefer to keep the money for themselves rather than send it to Brussels, if I can put it like that. There's one more attitude that Ukraine could take, which is the third one on my overhead, which is to try, there is no guarantee, to try to obtain an exemption from the CBAM. There is, in the CBAM legislation, there is an article which allows the Commission to decide on an exemption for a given country in the case of exceptional, unforeseeable, unprovoked circumstances. Now, I am not the Commission, but I reasonably think that the Commission could regard the war in Ukraine as a circumstance unforeseeable, exceptional, I'm sure you will agree, and unprovoked. So there is maybe a way to obtain from the EU Commission in Brussels an exemption for all of the Ukrainian sectors, and an exemption which would only be for Ukraine and not for Brazil or South Korea or Japan, because you are, as a country, in really exceptional circumstances. The only, well, one of the difficulties that I see is that this is a legislative procedure, and therefore it takes time. But to an extent, we have time, because the payments only start in 2026. So this is maybe a way. And then I wanted to write the fourth solution. The fourth solution is that in the long term, if the EU accession talks are successful, Ukraine will be in the EU, so will be in the ETS perimeter, will be in the ETS perimeter, and therefore the CBAM will not apply anymore. If a few years from now, with successful accession negotiations, you are an EU member state, like France, like Germany, then of course your industries will be subject to the ETS like everyone else here in the EU, but no CBAM anymore, because you will be inside of the borders. And there is this final potential end point, which is very positive, and we have to be optimistic, must be considered in deciding for the country if you do nothing, or if you put a carbon pricing on large industries, or if you try to obtain an exemption. Well, one has to, in defining the choice between 1, 2, 3, has to take 4 into account. That it could very well be in the long term that you are with us. Now, not sure how we are doing with time, but the last thing that I wanted to do, now that we've discussed the ETS, the CBAM, the circumstances in which this is putting the Ukrainian industry, a bit wider discussion of carbon markets and the long-term evolution of the Green Deal. The Green Deal that I've talked about many times already, it is simply a big set of energy, climate, environmental legislations. The Commission, when there is a new Commission, and there is going to be a new Commission a few months from now, a new Commission always like to invent new terms that everyone can remember. So 5 years ago, they invented the EU Green Deal instead of calling it an energy and climate package or anything else. And the Green Deal is that package of legislation. And it puts a price on CO2 emissions through the ETS, through the CBAM, through a few other things as well that we don't have time to discuss today. And so it really provokes in the rest of the world, as it is taken as an example, it's provoking the emergence of carbon prices a bit everywhere in very different ways. Because in some countries, it's going to be an ETS like the EU, but still different. In some other countries, it's going to be a simple carbon tax, which is much simpler, because then if it's a carbon tax, the number is known in advance. You know what you have to pay. It's not a market. It does not change every day. By the way, we could ask ourselves why the EU has not gone for a simple carbon tax. And the reason is a bit stupid, if you allow me. It's our decision-making mechanisms. We are now 27 member states. If we wanted to decide on a carbon tax, it's a taxation policy. And by the EU treaties, decisions on taxation policy require unanimity. There will always be someone against it. Now, I'm not going to give you any name, but you can think of people who will say no. So to avoid this, that's the reason why the EU has gone for the ETS, which is a market mechanism, because it has been classified as an environmental policy. And because it is an environmental policy, it only requires a qualified majority vote by the member states. So it was feasible. It's more complex for the industry, but it was politically feasible. That's why. But this is a parenthesis. What I wanted to show you is that there are carbon markets appearing in many other jurisdictions throughout the world. And another thing that you may hear of also is a totally different kind of carbon market. The carbon markets called offsets or compensations, or sometimes it's called the voluntary carbon market, VCM. This is a totally different thing because it's not defined by law. It is simply a number of bilateral agreements between companies. Between one which is willing to look green, like say Ryanair, and one which is willing to develop a project. And the project could be anything. The project could be planting trees in Nicaragua, for instance. So there are bilateral agreements like that between airlines selling green tickets. I'm not sure that they are fully green, on the basis of other companies which are planting trees in Nicaragua, which is a good thing, but there are many potential problems with all of this. For instance, if the project is to plant trees in Nicaragua, they could very well burn and go up in smoke 10 years from now. So the validity of the thing in the long term is very questionable. This is a totally different type of arrangement. Again, it's not a regulated carbon market. It is a voluntary carbon market, voluntary between two companies. So we really do not want to get confused between regulated markets like the ETS and the CBAM and the voluntary markets that you see if you buy an airplane ticket, which the company tells you is green. It's totally different, totally separate, totally independent. So there are many, many other types of carbon markets than just the EU ETS and the CBAM that we were discussing today. And to finish off, a few more words about the long-term evolution of the EU Green Deal. As I said, now we are entering into a new mandate. There is going to be a new European Commission in place, probably the 1st of November or the 1st of December, or at the latest the 1st of January next year, on the basis of the EU elections. We all voted in the EU. It was in June, early June. So there is a new mandate, there is a new boss. The boss is the same as the previous time. President von der Leyen, she stays, but all the commissioners, or many of the commissioners, will be different. There's been a campaign in between, the people voted. So priorities inevitably will change. And I think the direction of travel of the priorities is that the new mandate, which will be 2024, 2029, will probably look a lot more carefully than before at the sustainability, but at the competitiveness issue. Because the feeling is now that the competitiveness of the industry has been a bit neglected in setting up the Green Deal as it is now. So the new mandate will probably need to look at something that some people call the competitive sustainability. Anyway, difficult words, but what I really mean is that there will be more attention onto industrial competitiveness in the next years than in the past years. In the same context, the new mandate will probably look at the administrative burden to try to minimize the administrative burden. And that is funny, because the CBAM, which I have been talking about, is a big administrative burden on industries. Everyone who is importing one of those 6 categories of raw products has to fill in more paperwork, has to pay, is going to be inspected, and so on. So the administrative burden attention will maybe be a pressure to sort of minimize or keep the CBAM evolution to something more reasonable. However, through all of this, there is one thing which remains. It's the net zero objective 2050. That is in law, that stays, and the EU, in a very definitive way, is evolving towards carbon neutrality 2050. If you remember an hour ago when we started, I talked of the cap of the EU ETS, the number of allowances going down to 0 in 2039, which is 11 years before the date of 2050. So it shows that the ETS is in need of reforms between now and 2039. It's too early, 2039. Yeah? And so this regulatory landscape is in constant evolution. And again, this is something on which FTI Consulting, for whom I work, is ready to help, in relation with the EU Commission, for whom I work more than 20 years. And then I realized that there are more things appearing in the chat. Let me see, let me try to read. Yes, if national price for allowance will be higher than ETS, EU countries would pay the difference between ETS and the CBAM price. No. So that if you have a carbon price, say, in Ukraine, it is deductible from the CBAM, but if you set a carbon price which is higher than the CBAM, you don't get reimbursed when you send your product to the EU. You simply don't pay the CBAM, because everything is deducted, but it would be slightly stupid, if I can say so, to go for a local carbon price higher than the CBAM, which is difficult to guess, of course, because again, the CBAM is the ETS and the ETS is a market. And because it's a market, it could very well crash next year. No one knows. Huh? But if this was the case, no reimbursement, simply no CBAM left. We are a mining company based in Ukraine. We export more than 50% of our products to the EU. Our main competitors are Sweden, Canada, and Brazil. Ukraine has been in a different environment because of the war, but it needs to compete. Yes. Are ready to well, yes, this message of trying to obtain an exemption, it can only come from the Ukrainian government. It is basically a request that, of course, the industrial sectors can push the idea. And again, FTI Consulting, we are certainly ready to give you arguments, to support your arguments, to give you ideas, to make sure that the thing come in the right place in the commission and so on. But it is the idea of an exemption, which I think would make sense because you are in really exceptional circumstances, must come from the government. Even if initially it emerged in companies like yours and in sectors like yours. And, yeah. Now, as I said in my presentation, it sounds a good idea to try to obtain this exemption from the Ukrainian government point of view and thinking they must also put this in the context of the long-term accession negotiations. Because very long-term, let's hope, long-term, let's be optimistic, long-term, if the EU accession talks are successful, no CBAM left. But in that context, to require for an exemption is probably something which could make a lot of sense. I ask about connection between guarantee or origin market and ETS systems. No, there are no direct. Okay, now I see what you meant by guarantees of origin. The guarantees of origin are guarantees of origin in the context of what we call the Renewable Energy Directive. Then there is no direct link between this and the ETS. The guarantee of origin is if you produce renewable energy with any technique, then when you sell that energy as a fuel or as power, you can sell it with a guarantee of origin. Those guarantees of origin can very well cross the border. So if you end up selling biofuel from Ukraine to the EU, you sell it with a guarantee of origin. But this is separate from the ETS. It's another directive. It's another piece of law, which is the Renewable Energy Directive, which is taking care of the guarantees of origin. I realize that all of this is extremely complex, but this is the world in which we live. Olga, I don't know how we are set with time. I don't see more questions coming. The floor is presumably back to you.
Thank you, P'Y'er. If we have any questions, you are welcome to raise your hand and we will give you the floor as well. And from my side, I would like to thank you, P'Y'er, and I appreciate very much your knowledge, your expertise, and all your experience you've had from both sides, from the side of European Commission and industry representatives. And I hope that after today's webinar, you will be able to share your contacts with the participants so we can share it and spread it.
Yes.
In the...
I will send you my PowerPoint, so you please are very welcome to distribute it. And also in the other direction, if there were more questions coming, don't hesitate to get in contact with me, and we will stay in contact on all of those things. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate you. Okay, so one more time, if there's any questions, please let us know. And thank you, of course, for the questions you already asked in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, I see. So everything was too clear or either too complicated.
You never know. You never know which way it is. But anyway, as I said, if there are more questions coming, when you see my presentation, which I will send to Olga today, do not hesitate. We are here to help. Okay.
Okay, so thank you, dear participants, and thank you for your time in again, and thank you, Pierre, for this initiative and for your presentation. And I hope it's not our last meeting, and we will see each other soon during our future cooperation. So have a wonderful day and see you on our next webinars. Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
See you. Bye-bye.